Number 10. The Hollywood Ripper. Michael Gargiulo is the Hollywood Ripper. Judge Larry P. Fiddler from Los Angeles, California, called his crimes vicious and frightening when giving out the sentence for his terrible crime spree. The judge sentenced Gargiulo to death. He also said that everywhere Michael went, the death and destruction followed. Michael had a lot of jobs in his life. He was a bouncer for a while. He did some time as an air conditioning repairman, and he was an aspiring actor. But he also worked as a killer. He murdered Tracy Pacasio in 1993, Ashlyn Ellerin in 2001, Maria Bruno in 2005, and he tried to murder a woman in Santa Monica in 2008. Back in 2001, Ashley Ellerin was actually pen pals with the famous actor Ashton Kutcher. She was due to go on a date with the actor when she was discovered in her Hollywood home with 47 stab wounds. Kutcher had gone to her house in the hills and knocked at her door, but she never answered. He simply thought he'd been stood up, but in fact, she was lying dead inside at the hands of Michael Gargiulo. Why did Michael go on a random kill spree from 1993 to 2008? There's not really a good answer to this question. He targeted young and attractive women, and he brutalized them for no other reason than he wanted to. Number 9. The Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer went on a crime spree that lasted a decade. The spree was something out of a nightmare, who then used his knowledge of police work in the judicial system to get away with 13 murders and dozens of assaults through the 1970s and 1980s. His real name is Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., 74 years old, when he was finally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But some might say it was too little too late. He wasn't arrested until 2018, 3 decades after he stopped murdering. The guy had 3 adult daughters at the time, and a whole stable of grandchildren. He was considered the harmless grandfather, and yet he had a darker past than anyone in his family could have imagined. Like many killers from the 70s and 80s who were recently caught, James was tracked down and arrested because of DNA matches. We know that he began killing in 1975 in the Sacramento area. After his first few kills, he spread into the rest of the state and struck wherever he saw fit. But his spree ended as quickly as it started in 1986 when he murdered an 18-year-old girl. As quickly as the hunger had taken him over, it left him. He stopped killing and settled down. He was still a monster. Number 8. 4 decades of murder. Samuel Little spent 4 decades murdering. When he was finally apprehended, he confessed to committing 93 homicides. Through his confession, police were able to confirm at least 50 of them. That makes him the most prolific serial killer in the United States of America. And yet, nobody knows the guy's name. If you were to say Samuel Little, most people wouldn't bat an eye. Yet they know the names of dozens of other serial killers who are notorious, with way fewer murderers under their belts. Samuel began killing in 1971. He met a woman at a bar in North Miami, and something just came over him. After he murdered the woman, he realized he liked it. He then began targeting prostitutes and runaway teenagers, or women who had difficulties with drugs or alcohol. Most of these women were already missing people when they encountered Samuel Little, exiled from society. They weren't entirely missed. When a woman disappeared from a street corner in the 1970s, it didn't make national news. This wasn't like Ted Bundy, who went after young college students and professionals. This was ultimately what made Ted Bundy far more notorious and what got him caught in the end. It wasn't until recently that DNA evidence finally connected Samuel to several unexplained deaths. One of the killings had even been pinned on a carnival worker named Jerry Frank Townsend in 1979. He spent 22 years in prison before DNA evidence shifted the blame onto Samuel. Number 7. Green River Killer. Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer, is without a doubt the most famous man that we've talked about today. He himself claimed to have murdered at least 80 women, maybe even more. He killed them in the Seattle, Washington area. When he was finally convicted in 2003, he pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder. Even spread out over a 20-year span, this is a lot of murder. Gary needed to kill around 3 people a year, and to do it all without ever getting caught. He was methodical in his killing, strangling woman after woman and dumping their corpses in a random place to confuse the authorities. He never kept any trophies, he never told anyone what he was doing, and he never showed any signs of being a psychopath at the truck plant where he worked. He was also married 3 times, and none of his wives knew what he was up to in his spare time. The killings began in 1982 when a group of kids found the strangled corpse of Wendy Caulfield floating in the Green River. Over the next few weeks, 4 more bodies washed up on the river's banks. All of them were women, and all of them had been strangled. And here's what's really infuriating. Gary Ridgway was a suspect in 1983 following the death of Marie Malvar. Police questioned Gary at his home, but he denied ever knowing her. There was nothing until 2003 when he was finally arrested. When the cops got him, he admitted that during the original questioning in '83, he leaned against a fence to hide the scratches on his arm. Those scratches were left behind by Marie as she tried to escape. Number 6. Luxury vehicle theft spree. In Canada's biggest city, a luxury vehicle theft ring was just uncovered after 10 years of operation. According to the Toronto Police, working with officers in York, Niagara, Peel, and Halton, the crime spree saw dozens of the most expensive luxury vehicles be pulled out of people's driveways and sold for profit. The police finally cracked down on the thieves in Project Yellowbird. They conducted 30 raids across the Toronto area early on a Thursday morning, arresting 8 people in connection to approximately 150 theft charges. But as more and more stolen property is being discovered, the charges are going up and up. The thieves were targeting houses in rich neighborhoods with expensive vehicles. The people involved knew exactly what they were doing. The police raided 8 residences, 1 business, several storage lockers, and even a cargo container. The container had 2 stolen cars in it when they searched it. And considering these guys had been operating for decades already, the Canadian police probably don't have a clue how many actual thefts took place. They recovered 23 vehicles so far in connection to the thieves, but those were just the vehicles they hadn't sold yet. If they had 23 luxury cars ready to go when they were arrested, just imagine how many they shipped out over the last decade. Number 5. Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman was the worst serial killer in the history of the United Kingdom. He attended the Leeds School of Medicine and started working as a physician in the year 1970. Over the next 28 years, he killed no less than 215 of his patients. However, the real number could be as high as 260. He killed them with a lethal injection of painkillers. Harold was inspired to go to medical school after he watched his mother slowly die from terminal lung cancer. She passed away in 1963, and 7 years later, he graduated. By 1974, he was married to a woman named Primrose and had 2 children with her. He also had his very own medical practice and was thriving as a family practitioner. But he was caught in 1975 forging prescriptions for painkillers to feed his own addiction. He entered a drug rehab program and a few years later was working as a doctor at Donnybrook Medical Center. He worked at the hospital for nearly 2 decades. But at some point, the local undertaker noticed that many of his patients were dying. He also noticed they were all dying nearly the same way. The undertaker approached Harold, and so too did one of his medical colleagues who stumbled upon the same thing. The police got involved, but Harold was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing. It wasn't until much later when he was under suspicion again that it came out he was altering the medication records of his patients. When he was finally apprehended, there was no way for investigators to know exactly how many people he killed. He's been doing it ever since he was a doctor. Harold never cooperated with authorities. He denied every accusation, and they could only charge him with a total of 15 murders. Up until his death in 2004, he never said a word about why he killed all those people. Why do you think Harold did it? Let us know your theories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before the end of the video. Number 4. Legrella. For decades, the crime squad in Paris was haunted by the atrocities committed by a notorious, unidentified serial killer. Starting in 1986, Paris became the playground for an unknown psychopath. He started killing and didn't stop until the 1990s. But it wasn't until 35 years later that the Paris police finally identified their man. His name is Francois Verove, but the French call him Legrella. It translates to the pockmarked man. One of his first victims was arguably his most shocking crime. Cécile Bach was reported missing after she failed to show up to school in 1986. The girl was only 11 years old. What her parents didn't know at the time was that the pockmarked man had gotten a hold of her on her way to class and then brutally ripped her to shreds like a mad werewolf. But this was only one of his murders. He has now, thanks to DNA evidence, been linked to at least 4 in total. Yet according to Didier Saban, the lawyer representing the families of the victims, he is probably responsible for a lot more. His DNA only connects him to murders up until 1994. Theoretically, he could have kept on killing, but they finally caught up to him in 2021. He could have gotten a lot better at hiding his DNA. But because he's dead now, we'll never know the true tale of his crimes. Number 3. Todd KOHLHEPP. Todd KOHLHEPP was born in Florida in 1971. His parents divorced when he was only 2. His mother married a new man, and Todd had a rather unhealthy relationship with the new husband. Todd became a troublesome child. He was aggressive to other children as early as nursery school. By the age of 9, he was so explosively violent that he had to undergo counseling. Before he was even 10, he became obsessed with sexual content. He was cruel to animals, caught murdering a goldfish and shooting at dogs with a BB gun. In other words, he was a troubled psychopath from the very beginning. His mother and stepfather separated in 1983, and Todd went to live with his biological father in Arizona. He started collecting weapons, he learned how to make bombs, and he continued signs of being a generally unstable and violent person. On November 25, 1986, when Todd was only 15 years old, he kidnapped a 14-year-old girl. He took her back to his house, tied her up, and assaulted her. He then walked her home as if he were a gentleman, though he did threaten to kill her family if she told anybody what he did. She told on him anyway, and he was charged with kidnapping. In 1987, Todd was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was found to have borderline personality disorder and an IQ of way above average. A judge deemed him unlikely to be rehabilitated. He was let out in August of 2001 after serving 14 years. He graduated from the University of South Carolina with a Bachelor's of Science degree in 2008. On the outside, he looked quite successful. He had a real estate license. He built an entire real estate firm and had his own employees, and he even managed to get a private pilot license. He was also quite wealthy. Unbeknownst to those around him, he started killing almost immediately when he was let out of jail. In 2003, he walked into a motorcycle shop and shot 4 people for no reason. In 2016, Todd attacked 2 people who were sent to clear his house. The police found Charles Carver dead on Todd's property, then Kala Brown chained up to a wall in a metal storage container. Todd was arrested immediately. An additional search of his property revealed 2 more bodies identified as a husband and wife who had gone missing in 2015. Between 2003 and 2016, he killed a confirmed 8 people. How many more is still unknown. Number 2. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. preyed on the women of Los Angeles for more than 2 decades. On a warm Saturday evening in 2020, he was discovered unresponsive in his cell. He was pronounced dead just before 8 p.m. But if anything, his death came just a little earlier than expected. He was already sitting on death row for murdering a total of 10 people from between 1985 to 2007. Lonnie Franklin was one of the most prolific killers in California. Like many other serial killers, he targeted young and vulnerable victims. He was actually quite similar to Samuel Little. He targeted the poor and the destitute, which allowed him to fly under the radar as he went on killing. Plus, this was due to the crack epidemic of the 80s, when it seemed everywhere you looked in California, people were dying from drug overdoses. During his trial, prosecutors were able to connect him to all 10 slayings, but detectives say he probably killed upwards of 15 more women. And number 1, Robert Hansen. Robert Hansen spent the 1970s hunting women in the Alaska wilderness as if they were wild deer. He's known these days as the Butcher Baker. He was convicted in 1984 after confessing to murdering 17 women. During a crime spree that went on for 12 years, he picked off dancers and prostitutes while assaulting at least an additional 30 women, but not killing them. He was convicted for 4 of the murders, then handed a sentence of 461 years in prison. Sadly, Robert didn't spend almost 5 centuries suffering in jail. He died in 2014 at the age of 75 of seemingly natural causes. There's a movie about Robert Hansen called The Frozen Ground. It stars John Cusack, Nicolas Cage, and Vanessa Hudgens. Have you seen it? Do you think a serial killer could continue a crime spree for over a decade in this day and age? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe and come back soon for more awesome videos from the channel. See you next time.